thanks for joining me this morning for our session on grants for small businesses. My name is Kristy Bailey. I'm an advisor and a presenter for Business Station as part of the Digital Solutions Commonwealth Government program. I have managed and owned my own businesses and worked with other small businesses for many years, but a lot of what I have done has been based in and around that grant space. So I've successfully received more than 10 grants for a selection of businesses. So today what we're going to go through is some key information on grant funding, why it exists, but also how you can maximise your efforts to try and have success in the grant space yourself. Now, the webinar is designed to be interactive, so please use the Q&A functionality or even the chat box to ask questions at any time. Do keep in mind that I'll stay on for a few minutes at the end of the session as well to allow some time for questions. So we'll get right into it. Now, first of all, what is available to you as a small business? Well, there's grants, of course, but there is a range of other support that I'm going to talk about as well, because I think it can be equally, if not in some cases more important than grant funding itself. Now, most grants, when we're talking about actual funding, is available from either a state government or at a state government or a federal government level. There is also also grants available at a local shire, and sometimes, even a regional level, just really depending on where you're located and what sort of business you're in. Do keep in mind that government grants are generally for specific projects, not for business as usual or general business. Most of the time you'll need a specific plan to be eligible and not just to have a business idea, so to speak. So there are a few grants that are specifically for starting a business, but there's also, as I mentioned, the other support that you should consider outside of the grant space. In terms of grants, most of the things that you'll come across will be for things like expansion, training, research and development, importing and exporting, also commercializing a specific product if it's a new product. But in terms of the other support, there's low cost and sometimes free support available to small businesses. Now, business advisory services can be absolutely fantastic. We're part of the Digital Solutions program, which is a mentorship / advisory plus a training program. So with this particular program, you get one-on-one or you can access one-on-one mentorship with an advisor. So that kind of thing can be absolutely invaluable and can actually establish you and get you ready for a grant application as well as a range of other things. Sometimes you can get financial and tax advice. Sometimes there's assistance with loans and other small business support. So a lot of that government assistance takes the form of, other support outside of grants specifically. So keep an eye out for that. And obviously you've joined this webinar, which is part of a Commonwealth Government grant. But basically grants funding and support exist so that small businesses can achieve a government policies, basically, and that could be economic or social policies. And generally speaking, it's around a thriving economy, to reduce unemployment or increase employment, and to build stronger communities. So basically this support, whether it be grant funding or actual support, allows you as a small business to carry out the functions that the government absolutely needs to make the economy function well. So always keep that in mind. Now, before you look at opportunities for grant funding or support, in terms of grants, you need to determine if you're grant ready. Now, I believe that grant success can be directly correlated to overall business success. So you need to have a really strong business plan, a strong marketing strategy, and have all of those bits and pieces in place to make sure that you can effectively answer application questions in the first instance. Now, to be able to answer questions in the most effective way, you have to have that intimate knowledge of the business plan and marketing strategy that sits around the project that you're applying for the grant funding for, which may differ to your general business. You have to know how that strategy is going to be implemented, and you have to have the resources to be able to do so as well. So keep that in mind. If you've got that clear understanding, you've got proven research on how that strategy will succeed or how the business plan or project plan will succeed, then you've got a much higher likelihood of success. So the value of a grant is really how it enables business success. So the true test of that strategy is that it's going to deliver the specific outcome that's directed or dictated by the government organisation that you're applying for the funding through. So I'll mention that quite a bit today by way of objectives and specific outcomes, because it's so important that your project is perfectly aligned with the specific outcome or the objectives of the funding body. Now, in terms of what you're going to need to apply for a grant, you will generally need an ABN. You will have to be operating in the state that is providing the grant funding. You will have to have any relevant licenses or approvals, or you'll have to have a very clear and confident pathway on how you can obtain them should you be successful for the funding. You'd have to have a very clearly defined target market, so you have to know who's going to buy your product or service. And in some cases, you will have to demonstrate proof of match funding. So depending on who the funding is through, they will generally state whether or not it's 100% funding, or if it's 50-50, if you have to have some kind of input yourself. Now, in most instances, any grant funder is going to want the business to have some kind of skin in the game, so to speak. So you will find that there will be an element of matched funding in some, but not all cases. So do keep that in mind. Now, what the funding can be used for, essentially, as I mentioned, it's really to achieve government policy objectives. Now, grants are paid out each year, and it's in the billions of dollars that are given to the non-government sector to be able to achieve these policy objectives. Now, it's to benefit the public and the economy, obviously, but this could be through increased social services. It could be to offer expanded services or opportunities for businesses. Sometimes there's emergency relief funding available, and in a lot of cases there is. We've seen quite a bit of that recently with COVID, but floods and fires and that kind of thing, cyclones even. And then there's research and innovation areas as well. But depending on where the funding is coming from, those objectives will vary. But in all cases, you'll have to have a realistic project. You'll have to have a strong and dedicated backing. And you have to really be able to demonstrate that high likelihood of success for your business. Now, some considerations when you're deciding to submit an application. First of all, think about the financial side of things. Do you have the financial capacity to be able to carry out the project? Now, most grants are match funding. If they're not match funding, there is a chance that they won't, that the funds won't actually cover your entire project. So do you have the financial capacity to make up the difference? The resources are important as well. So do you have the resources that you need to deliver the project? Now that could be time, it could be staff, and obviously financial as well. Is the project consistent with your overall business strategy? Is it a question that I would sort of ask yourself? That's really important. One thing you don't want to do as a small business, and whilst it could be in the perimeters of the grant application, but you don't want to diversify your business too much to the point that you're taking away from your core or existing business. So you don't want to jeopardize your business to carry out a particular project just because there's funding available for it. If it complements and works and ties in with your overall business strategy, then it can be a great opportunity. Time resources are absolutely crucial. I did mention that when I said resources, but time is a major factor. You have to be able to allow the time to just complete the application in the first instance, and then of course carry out the project. So think about time, and again, does time on this project or even on this application take away from your core business? You'd also need to determine if your business meets the eligibility requirements. So there will be some pretty clear and distinct eligibility requirements. So work through those and just make sure that all stacks up. And in any grant opportunity or any other submission, whether it be a tender application, absolutely anything, you have to weigh up the risk and the opportunity. So is the risk worthwhile, and can you take time, spend the money and utilize the resources to actually apply for this grant funding and carry out the project should you be successful. Okay, so if you found a suitable grant and you're looking into it further to decide if you're going to apply, there will be some pre-application considerations. First of all, and I have touched on eligibility, there is a pretty clear criteria that will normally be released or published, will definitely be published, and you just need to consider if your business meets that eligibility criteria. Now, that will start with determining what type of organisation the funding body is looking to fund. So is it a not-for-profit, proprietary limited, sole trader? What does the funding body actually specifically state by way of organisations that they will actually be looking to fund? I would recommend that you have a good and thorough read through the guidelines. There'll be process requirements, there'll be application forms, so I would read through it all and download all available supporting information. So terms and conditions, frequently asked questions, there'll be application tips. If you download absolutely everything that's available to you and have a very thorough read through it, you might get to a point in there where you go, this isn't for me, and you're not wasting any more time, energy or effort actually reading through it, or it might encourage you further to continue on with the application. So certainly thoroughly read all supporting information. Early in the piece, I would determine what the funding body is looking to achieve and make sure that your project can satisfy the funding body's objectives. You'll keep referring back to these objectives. You'll hear me talk about the objectives for the next hour or next 45 minutes at least. So absolutely look at those objectives and always refer back to them. I would ask questions or seek clarification from the funding body as well. So there's going to be a period of time in which you can go through and ask questions. So I would absolutely make use of that. Sometimes they have sessions, briefing or information sessions, and you can attend those. Some people will ask questions that you perhaps hadn't thought of. So you can get a lot of information from those. Or at other times you can actually reach out and get more information. So there might be a window of opportunity where you can go through and privately ask questions. Sometimes a funding body, after that period's closed, will then release another sort of FAQ type document where they address all of the new questions that came in for other applicants, but not always. So absolutely ask your own questions and attend any sessions where there's other people asking questions, because you can learn a lot just from that part of the process alone. Preparation is absolutely key in anything to do with business, but most importantly in a grant application. You have to make sure that you're well and truly prepared just for the application process alone. Now, there's some things that you'll need to take into consideration, and I've mentioned time a couple of times, but you have to allocate sufficient time to actually complete the application. Don't expect that you can do it last minute. Now, sometimes, unfortunately, you come across a grant opportunity quite late in the piece and you realise that you're pushed for time because you've only just been made aware of it and it's closing, in a week or 2 weeks' time, and that's unavoidable. But the more grant aware you are, and we'll talk a little bit about this shortly, but the more in tune you are with what could potentially be coming up, the more reduced you're going to sort of make that risk. So do keep that in mind. But if you're made aware of a grant opportunity early on, so when it's released, for example, just make sure that you're allocating sufficient time over a period of time. So treat it like a project in its own right. Have a project team and have more of a team approach to the application. You might want to have a brainstorm and get input from other team members as well. So get everyone to have input into, maybe you could explain what the grant is what project you're considering, have a look through the questions and how you might answer them, and get other feedback from other members of your business or your team to have a little bit of input. It's all up to interpretation. So if you have a question there that you need to answer and you're the only person that's read it and you've got it in your head how you're going to respond to that question, you might sort of miss something. So bouncing ideas off other people within your company or within your team can be really valuable as well. If you are treating the process as a project and you've got that team approach, I would strongly encourage you to identify the people that need to have input into the application, and if sort of who does what and by when. So have that project sort of approach. There might be people that are involved in the planning and the actual strategy development. If it's a custom design document that you'll be submitting, you might need someone to just do, like, pull everyone's info together and do the document design and the overall presentation of it. You might have someone that, again, pulls pieces of information from various departments within your business or from various people in your business, and they then write and collate the information. So it's all written in the same tone from the same voice, essentially. You'll most definitely need information from a bookkeeper and accountant. So keep that in mind. That's a crucial element of it. And I'll talk to you shortly about some of the info that you'll need to gather, but it's really good to get onto that stuff early to give people plenty of time. So I would recommend that you do keep really good information or good records, of all of the information that's required, and then set deadlines for anyone that's involved in the process, what they need to provide you and when. Now, that could be deadlines for yourself as well, so don't forget that. You would definitely want to have those deadlines for yourself, just to keep track and make sure that you're not missing out on any particular time frames that you need to meet, or getting too far behind so that it will be rushed in the end. So when you do rush at the end of anything like this, there's a higher likelihood of error, mistakes, completely forgetting different documents, and it's just not a position that you want to be in. So in terms of that info gathering, I think it's a really key part of the application process. There's going to be documents that you might need to get that will take time to get. So you have to request them from your accountant or some other third party. So some of it's not hard work as such, but in saying that, you don't want to be caught out at the last minute just because you didn't give someone enough time. So I would look at gathering those internal and external inputs really early in the process and collate the information that you require. So that could include anything. It could include, from a legal perspective, it could include your corporate details, your insurances and certificates of currency around the insurance space. It could be as simple as your ASIC and business name, registration certificates or documentation. Sometimes you'll need referees' details or written testimonials. Sometimes it could be brochures and marketing literature, policies, procedures, work instructions. There could be ISO certifications, for example, that you will need to have to be successful for the grant, but perhaps you haven't achieved them or obtained them yet. Any other licenses or permits that may be relevant to being able to operate in the location that the project is going to be carried out. Cvs of key personnel or business owners. Now, as a small business owner, you may find that you don't actually have a CV because you've owned a business for such a long period of time, but the funding body is going to want to see your breadth and depth of experience and ability to carry out the project. So that might be something that you need to create. You'll definitely have to have a business plan and a marketing plan. But in most cases, you'll have a description of your overall business, but the business plan and the marketing plans tend to be specific to the actual project. So do keep that in mind as well, that whilst you may have existing business documentation, this is going to be project specific. So there might be something new that you need to develop there. You'll need to have a proposed budget, which is going to basically outline how the grant funding is going to be used. Budgeting is a crucial component of grant applications. So we're going to go through budgeting in a little bit more detail shortly, but it is something that you're going to have to, there will be information that you'll have to obtain around that budget space. And that could be anything from quotes to, research that you have to do on how much things are going to cost and what's going to be included in the budget. You'll have to have a really defined project. And when I say defined, you might have it in your head of what sort of project you'd like to carry out. But that project description is absolutely crucial. It's so important that you get that right. The actual description aligning with the objectives as well. So that's really, that crucial link between what your project is and the aims and objectives of the funding body. And then obviously aligning that with the budget. So we'll talk a little bit more about that now that we're going into the budget side of things. Now, when it comes to budgeting, you do have to be really careful in the budget space, because if you're successful, you'll have to spend the funds exactly as you've outlined in the budget. So there's not too much room for variation there. In some cases there is, but not, that is an application process in its own right to change any budget of a successful grant application. So you will need to complete a really accurate outline of your program or your project costs. They'll have to be eligible under the grant that you're applying for as well. So there's a couple of elements there. There may be things that you need to, or money you need to spend to carry out the project, but they're not eligible and therefore they wouldn't be included in your project budget. But you have to know as a business that you will have to fund those yourself. So firstly, you have to understand the funding body's requirements. So before you prepare your program or research, the grant budget, you have to check the format that's required. So some funders will allow you to use your own budget template. Others will provide you with a template that incorporates their budget lines and categories. And in a lot of cases with grant applications now, it's an online format. So you might want to create a budget in an Excel document, and then you'll transfer the figures once it's finalized in your own document. You'll transfer the figures over to their format online, for example. You do have to have that really clear understanding of what types of expenses are eligible, because not all expenses will be. And this really varies grant to grant and, funding body to funding body, but really understand what's eligible. So that's why I recommend doing a budget in your own Excel document, for example, where you can list realistically what are all the expenses that you're going to incur for this project to be undertaken, and then break out what's covered under the grant and what's not. Because if there's elements of the project that you have to buy, basically they're genuine expenses, but the grant doesn't cover it, then you have to make sure that you can actually fund that independently. So understanding those eligible expenses is crucial. You will have to work with other companies to determine costs. So creating the budget for grants requires working obviously with your own team, but also suppliers that will be running the project or the program. So you'll need to understand what their anticipated costs are going to be, and they'll have to understand the project quite well. Now, this is a really important part, because a lot of the time, a grant, there's quite a bit of lead time in an application process and then the approval process. So there's a bit of, a big variance in time there. So let's say you're applying now for a grant and, the application process doesn't close to the end of August, and they don't announce who's successful until 1st of September, but your project can't start until the 1st of October. So that means you're getting a quote in July, but you're not able to start the project until October. So you have to be really careful there that any supplier quotes that you get are still going to be valid and relevant when you start the project. Now, this can be a really interesting area. You might have to work with your suppliers and just explain to them that this project isn't going to start till October. You need to have some guarantee that the prices will be the same when it does start in October, and work with the supplier to try and agree to those terms. Otherwise, you might go through all this process, get the funds approved be ready to start your project, and then all of a sudden your supplier quotes are no longer valid and the project costs have skyrocketed. So be really careful with that and work with your suppliers. Be open with them about what you're doing and clearly disclose those timeframes. So that's really important. Now, in terms of, I guess, improving your chances to get approved, you have to make sure that your grant budget is consistent with the grant objectives and with your project description. So you'll have a document that's published by the funding body that will clearly outline the grant objectives. You'll then have your own project description. So those two should be aligned, and then the budget has to be aligned with both the grant objectives and your project description. So always link these three things together and really cross-check them. Everything you've mentioned in your project description has to be featured on your budget, essentially, and has to align with those objectives. So really go back and forth and be thorough with that. Now, things that you can consider including, obviously, direct costs for grants or the funds that you're asking for can be personnel or staff costs. It could be travel, purchase of equipment. There'll be supplies, which you'll probably have to break down into categories. There may be in-kind contributions, so volunteers, you know, and that kind of thing that you can factor in because it sort of represents the true cost of the project. And then there could be indirect costs like overheads and overheads like leases and that kind of thing. So consider both, but obviously check eligibility. And also keep in mind that a high quality budget will really increase your likelihood of getting this across the line. It also makes it a lot easier for you to actually run the project or carry out the project because you'll know exactly how much you can spend and you can really work within that budget. And lastly, it really helps you prepare a grant report at the end of the project when it's time to report back to the funder by way of some kind of acquittal. So that's a really key element as well. So keep in mind that once you've got the money, it's absolutely not over. As part of your agreement, that acquittal process will be really important. And the funding body will certainly be looking at exactly what's approved and making sure that that is exactly what was spent. Also keep in mind that writing a budget for your grant is not the same as an organisation's operating budget as such. This is all going to be completely project specific. Okay, some budget do's and don'ts. First of all, don't request too much. So don't request more than the maximum amount that's available because it may make your application ineligible. But even if, you know, it gets past that sort of hurdle, it might just indicate to the panel or the assessors that you haven't read the guidelines properly. So it kind of makes you lose a bit of professionalism, if not entire ineligibility. Do not expect payment for your entire project. A grant would generally not cover an entire project. There will be some kind of additional contributions from other sources. So I would generally expect that. Now, sometimes it could be in-kind support. It could be contributions from yourself personally or other directors or your business. It could be input by way of generated income like sales or fees associated with a project. Or other grants. There could even be sponsorships and donations. But again, in terms of eligibility, they will clearly outline, the funding body will clearly outline what is eligible to be used towards or as funding for the project, particularly if it's match funding. So it's 50-50, your 50%, they'll be very clear on how you can get that 50%. Do absolutely read all the information provided. There'll be explanatory notes in the budget section of the application form, so go through that. Those notes are very much intended to guide you to complete the budget and provide you examples of different types of income and expenditure items that you might like to include. I would absolutely do that draft budget before you transfer it to the application form, as I said. And then, you know, that way you can sort of just go back and forth and adjust individual figures, recheck total amounts and that kind of thing. But before you transfer it into their format, make sure that any tweaks that you've done have been accounted for, that they're eligible, that they still tie into the project description and the funding body's objectives. Generally, we do not include GST in budget figures. Again, the funder will clearly state that, but yeah, that's 99% of the time, GST is not included. Do certainly estimate in-kind support. So that's, as I mentioned, those non-cash items that are donated to your project. You'll only be able to provide estimates of their value, of course, but they're important because it does show the real cost of your project. Certainly do contact the funding body for guidance in completing your budget. You know, they will certainly help you. And again, there will be, generally speaking, someone that you can talk to, or a Q&A type session, or a briefing session on the budget side of things. And my last recommendation is to do the expenses first. So that expense section of the budget, do it first. Be realistic about what you ask for. So don't underestimate the time and the cost of the project. Almost do like a maximum budget, a wish list sort of budget. You know, if we were to do the project in its full sort of breadth, this is how much it would cost. But be really careful that you don't inflate your costs, because assessment committees or you know, funding assessors will look very carefully at budget issues. They will be looking for value for money as well. So they will know roughly what certain things will cost, and then they will be keeping a pretty close eye out for anything that looks overly inflated. So make sure that you assess the personnel time involved. Definitely approach those suppliers to verify their costs and availability, and get quotes that are relevant to when the project can actually be carried out. Think about things like travel, accommodation, living allowances, if anything like that is needed, cost of materials, equipment hire, all of those things. So do the expenses first, then do the income section. And that really will come down to how much you can apply for this particular grant or this particular opportunity. If adding on, if there's any in-kind support you can source, are there any cash donations or sponsorship opportunities, and is there any earned income? Lastly, to make up the difference, what can your organisation actually contribute to the project? So keep that in mind. Now, there could also be things like confirmed or unconfirmed income from other grants for the project. And eligibility wise, from a budget perspective, they will state what is eligible versus what is not. But keep in mind, budgets always have to be balanced. So that income has to equal your expenditure. And if you've completed that budget and it balances, perfect, you're on to the next step. But if not, you need to keep going back and reworking it until it does balance out. And if that means cutting out items because you can't afford them, then you have to understand whether or not the project can go ahead. Or it may mean that you have to contribute more, and in which case you have to ask yourself if that is actually a reality for the business. Also, just a reminder that any item that's on your budget has to be linked back to the description of your project and the objectives of the grant. I know I've said it about 10 times already, but it's so crucial. Don't start introducing new things into the budget section that you haven't mentioned in the project description, or that aren't, you know, in line with the objectives of the grant. Okay, in terms of writing responses, I would certainly write in accordance with the application guidelines by answering specific questions and thoroughly reading those questions before you answer them, so that you truly understand them. And that's where I think getting a bit of a team involved is hugely valuable. I think it's so important to interpret that question right, because how you respond to it will be solely based on your interpretation of the question. So get a little bit of input from others to make sure that you do really interpret, you know, and are on the right track by way of what the question is actually in the first place. Be clear and detailed. So provide those clear and detailed descriptions of how the proposal is actually going to be, or the project, I should say, is going to be implemented. As well as the description of your organisation. So you're going to have to establish your credibility and qualifications for the funding. With the project, you have to clearly define the aims and objectives of the project, outlining how the objectives are going to be achieved, and which could come down to sort of how it's going to be measured, but also linking those outcomes or projected deliverables back to the funding body's objectives. Now, this could be by way of benefit to the community or the target group. obviously there'll have to be benefits to the business. You think about things like the creation of jobs, preservation of existing jobs in the region that you're operating. So you really have to demonstrate how the proposal is going to benefit in line with those objectives. Certainly identify and demonstrate an awareness of the specific needs of the funding body and of the target group or the community that you're operating in. And you can do that with evidence or up-to-date and accurate data based on research that you've done about you're really just establishing needs and that your project is going to fulfill those needs. I'd certainly write factually as well. The information you submit has to be accurate because it's going to be audited. So be bold and positive, but don't over-exaggerate anything. Provide evidence wherever you can, and that will really support your application. Also, repeat that link to funders' objectives. Now, another tip that I have with regards to writing your responses is have a look at websites and annual reports, and I'll show you, we'll go through this shortly, so I'll show you where you can find this information, but have a look at the type of funding or the type of organisations or the type of projects that have been funded in the past, and have a read through what has been successful, because this might give you a bit of insight or some tips into your project, or even just a couple of ideas around your project. It's always good to know what has worked in the past. In terms of your writing style, make sure that your document structure is set out clearly, same logical sequence as the questions, using the same headings. Now, that's relevant if you have the ability to create your own sort of document structure. In a lot of cases, and what we're seeing most commonly now with the grant application, is that it all goes into an online portal where it's a fill-in format. So they will clearly say how they want the questions answered, whether it is online or whether it's by way of the document, but just make sure that it's clear and in that same logical sequence. With your answers, you have to be succinct, using very simple and concise language, so not waffling on or repeating things too much. You have to keep in mind that someone has to read this application along with a lot of other applications. So you want it to be a very straightforward process where they can get from the start to the end of your document with as fewer barriers as possible, and understanding and being confident that when they get to the end, that your project is worthwhile investing in or funding, and that it will satisfy their objectives. A good project title is always going to work well. Now, that's something that's creative or interesting would be good. In some cases, you can write a bit of a executive summary or something like that, but in any case, that short project title is what's going to be used in the media most of the time when they're announcing who was successful as well. Now, don't forget, you can repeat key messages. That's really using persuasive techniques. You do have to reinforce a message sometimes to the assessor to make sure that those messages are getting conveyed, but make sure that they're articulated well, and make sure it's not just a straight copy and paste of information. So, you don't want to be just copy and pasting that one-liner so that it keeps popping up throughout your submission. Make sure that if you're repeating key messages, they are unique. You should also have that professional layout. If it's a custom document, so it's not a fill-in format online, make sure that your fonts are consistent. You're using graphs and tables or photos or charts, diagrams, that kind of thing where it's relevant. Break things up with headings and subheadings or short bullet points and paragraphs, just so that it's easily digestible by the assessors. Don't use any vague or speculative or even emotive words. I would keep it really concise and factual. So things like you believe, you hope, you may, might, could, those kind of things get a little bit vague. So keep an eye out for that. Now, if you're submitting an online application, a lot of the time you will be required to stick to a word count. So keep that in mind. Sometimes the words don't seem like enough, like, you need an extra 500 words to convey your message. That could be a good indication that you're waffling a little bit. Or if you've got not much to say, so let's say it's the question requires a 700-word answer and you've only got 200 words, then that's probably a good indication that you haven't included enough information. So I would try, without waffling, I would try and aim for a relevant number of words. So the number of words that they're asking for, I'd try and get close to that mark, because it is a good indication of weighting of the question. So how heavily weighted that question is, but how much information they're seeking. Okay, some final do's and don'ts. Do tailor your application for a specific grant. So keep in mind that you might apply for lots of different grants, but each will have a different criteria that you have to meet and is designed for its own specific purpose. So your application has to be specific to those needs. So keep that in mind. Do address all eligibility criteria and answer every application question, and be succinct when you do so, but be thorough in your answers as well. If you're not able to answer a question, or like I said, if your content is a little bit light on, then it usually means that you're not quite ready, or that you need to do some more to be able to answer sufficiently. So don't guess, don't leave things blank, get informed, get the right information and put it in there. Otherwise, you may need to hold off and not quite submit for a grant as yet. You certainly have to have a grant strategy. It really helps to know what grants you're eligible for well ahead of time. Like I said, that means that not only are you starting your application early in the piece, but if you know that there's certain funding that will be released over a series of 4 rounds over 4 years, it means that you can map out a bit of an application timeline for yourself and systematically address each grant. And they may be there may be crossovers with projects, so you might have to tailor different projects to different grants, but really having a more of a strategic approach to grants and knowing what grants might be suitable for your business is hugely valuable. Certainly do consider specific projects instead of the business as a whole. Now, most funding bodies will be very clear with this, and they will be awarding grants for specific business activities like product development, import or export, recruiting or training, expansion, those kind of things that I mentioned earlier. Not just general startup, but in saying that, or general business, but in saying that there could be some of those grants depending on the industry. Don't apply for grants that you're unlikely to get. A proper grant application will take you a lot of time and effort, so I wouldn't waste it on something that you're not likely to get. Don't assume that a good startup with a good idea is good enough. I think that, grants and government business assistance are really awarded for the fulfillment of specific requirements, like I said earlier. So that'll vary between grants, but just generally having a good idea isn't going to satisfy objectives of a funding body in normal circumstances. Don't not follow up. I would say that because there are so many startup and small business grants available, and it is possible that you will apply for a number of them, certainly follow up on any grant applications that you've input, whether you're successful or not. Most importantly, if you're unsuccessful, try and speak to the grant administrator and get some information on why you weren't successful and how you can improve for next time, or how you might have better addressed certain eligibilities or areas, because you can get a lot of information for that. Sometimes you'll have a period of time, or even be able to make an appointment with one of the assessors, or not a specific assessor, but a representative of the organisation or the funding body, where you can go through some feedback. In terms of writing your application, you can use a professional grant writer's services. So do keep that in mind. That's a question I get quite often, whether you can or not. It can really improve your chances, or it can help you save time. But I also think that you can most definitely apply for grants yourself. If you're looking for a grant writer, ask about their experience, ask about their fees and their success rate of that particular grant before you agree to anything, and definitely shop around and speak to a couple of different people. But having someone that specialises in the grant that you're applying for or in your industry is going to be really helpful. But don't be misled in that you're going to have to provide a significant amount of information to that grant writer. So you can't just say to them, apply for this grant, that's it, come back to me when you get it. You are going to have a lot of input into this process because you will generally be the knowledge holder. So you would most likely be that person within the business or within the organisation that can answer a lot of these questions. They're just going to be putting that in writing and really aligning what you're wanting to do with the objectives. So do keep that in mind. It doesn't eliminate you of any role in this process at all. It just reduces the amount of input you'll have to have and potentially increases your chances. So some final tips before we go on to some specific grants and support that is available. Keep in mind, grant writing isn't easy. When you've got a large application and a large application process, plus you need supporting documentation and that kind of thing, it can be a difficult task. There may be funding opportunities that come along quite often. Keep in mind, the more you do it, the easier it will be. But some top tips for success will be to, first of all, make the document easily understood by an assessor. Make it engaging for the assessor. It is a real person that's reading it. So put yourself in the shoes of a grants reviewer. They might need to read lots of different applications. And if you've got a clear application that sets the scene for a case and it's enthusiastic, you can clearly, your driving points home and you're being very clear in terms of meeting the objectives, then you'll have a lot more chance of success. Being clear, concise, and that right tone of voice. Up-to-date data with clear language is also going to be helpful. In the case that you're applying for a federal grant, I would also keep in mind that in terms of making it easy for the assessor to understand, that you clearly describe your location. So if there's any regional limitations, or, keep in mind that if you're on the West Coast and you've got an assessor from the East Coast, they may not have that same knowledge of distances, regions, areas, and that kind of thing. Also, don't get caught up using jargon. Certainly answer all your questions in full. If you can't answer a question, there's a good chance that obviously you won't have success in that grant application, but perhaps you're not ready. So go back to that. Revise a lot. Your goal is really to develop this clear and concise application that communicates your project really effectively and really passionately. Don't let it be broken down with spelling or grammar errors. So waffling sentences, vague ideas can really hinder that overall application. If you can get someone to read through it, that fresh set of eyes is going to really help you address things that you might have left out or clarify different points. You will probably be very, very close with this grant application. So it's always good, you can overlook things because you've read something so many times. Also submit ahead of time. So submit that application as per the guidelines, but try and do it ahead of time if you can, with not leaving it to the last minute. You might encounter some unexpected, upload errors and those kind of things. Stress can play absolute havoc on you, and you don't want to miss out on any component of the application because you're rushed trying to make a deadline. So there's some top tips. Now, we've just had a question come in from someone that's looking to apply for the Perth CBD revitalisation grant program for a not-for-profit business, and that's to cover costs of an annual event. You've previously received partial grants from the City of Perth but have never received the full amount, normally less than half. Any specific tips for improving on that success rate? That's a really interesting question, and I would ask whether or not you have actually got feedback as to why you haven't got the full amount. Now, sometimes there can be a couple of reasons. There could have been items in there that were not eligible. So therefore, they've only funded you what the eligible items are. The other thing is it could have been a competitive grant process where they only had, let's say they've only got $1 million to give away, and they've had, 100 businesses apply, and therefore they can only give the equivalent amount, and they've given an even share to every business. So there could be a couple of reasons around that, but I would certainly seek feedback as to why. But I would say they would be the two most likely reasons. Now, I did say earlier, by way of budget, sometimes they just will throw your whole application out if you ask for items that are ineligible, whereas sometimes funders might agree to the funding, but they only fund the eligible items. So either. It could be one of those things, but feedback will be the key in determining that for you. So hopefully that answers your question, Laura, but please shoot through another question if I haven't. And whilst you're doing that, we're going to talk about some specific grants that exist at the moment or have most recently existed, and where you can get more information. Now, keep in mind that grants are mostly match funding. So there's also rebates, there's subsidies, there's incentive schemes or tax offsets, there's training and development, there's advising and mentoring services and low interest loans. There's all kinds of things. But in terms of some of the current grants, what we've seen, obviously lockdown assistance, hopefully we are well and truly past the point of lockdowns, but in most regions, there has been some kind of small business assistance by way of, covering loss of income or spoilage costs and that kind of thing to businesses affected by lockdowns. So if ever anything like that happens, certainly consider and have a look at what you might be eligible for. Most of the time it will be covered quite extensively in the media, but not always. So have a look at that. The Export Market Development Grant is a fantastic one that not enough businesses take advantage of. Only around 4,000 small businesses each year actually take advantage of this. And what it is, it's basically support of up to 50% of export promotion expenses. So if you're spending more than $5,000 and you're either a new or a current exporter, the EMDG grant is a great financial assistance program where you can get reimbursement of 50% of those promotional expenses back. So in the past, you have applied for that retrospectively, but it's reorientated from a reimbursement model to a grant application. So it's a lot simpler application process. The rules are a lot simpler. You basically, outline what your export program is going to be, apply for the funding, and then you get some certainty over a 2 to 3 year period as to what you're going to get, basically what you can spend. So keep that in mind. If you have applied for this in the past, my understanding is that you can reapply for this now that it's changed. So keep that in mind. Recently, there was a small to medium enterprise recovery loan scheme. So that has recently closed, but these kind of things are really, really helpful. Now, this one is a government guarantee on loans. So you could have a secured or a completely unsecured loan, still all done through your bank, but the government was offering a guarantee. So a good opportunity to refinance, to get new equipment, to expand your business, or purely to recover from the effects of COVID lockdowns and that kind of thing. So like I said, that one has ended, but only not that long ago. So certainly keep an eye out for similar things in the future. Back funding, which is the boosting apprenticeship commencement funding and wage subsidies. Again, they closed on the 30th of June, but it was a fantastic initiative. I think it was Australia's best kept secret, because there's not many businesses that actually took advantage of that. And it was absolutely fantastic for small businesses, whereby you could sign up someone as what they deem to be an apprentice, but not an apprentice as you would think of it. Apprentice could be someone that was newly contracted or newly employed by you in a part-time or full-time role and was undertaking one of many certificates that they had listed as being eligible. Now, that was anything from computing to leadership and management to your genuine apprentice type things, whether it be a baker, an electrician, and that kind of thing. So that one, for small businesses, you were eligible for a wage subsidy of $7,000, up to $7,000 per quarter for a year, so $28,000 rebate per employee. It has just ended on the 30th of June, but I would expect to see something hopefully come out in the future that is similar, because it was a great program. And not a lot of uptake from what I could gather, just in talking to a lot of businesses. There didn't seem to be many that were aware of it. The Boosting Female Founders funding, now that's gone through several rounds. The most recent round has recently closed, but I would keep an eye on that one for next year. It's if you're 51% female owned and led, you can apply for funding to scale up your business. And again, this funding was fantastic, a range of projects. It was highly competitive, but I think it was, up to $400,000 or something like that. So some, good amounts that were available. So keep an eye out for that one. There's a lot of industry-specific grants, and these range from regional economic development to tourism, specifically Indigenous tourism, business events. There's travel support schemes and that kind of thing. So have a look at your specific industry and see if there's anything, even like I said, the event space is a big one at the moment where there's a lot of funding as well. The Small Business Technology Investment and Small Business Skills and Training boosts are newly released, and they are fantastic as well. So that is the equivalent of 120% tax deduction for small business technology investment and also small business skills and training. So if you are investing in any of those areas, then you'll get that 120% tax deduction. So it's a really good incentive to have a look at those two elements of your business. But there are a range of other grants available. I'm going to go through now some resource areas that you can actually find more information in what might be suitable to your specific business. First of all, my number one go-to would be the business.gov, the grants and programs page. It has a fantastic grant finder tool that you can use to see what sort of grants you might be eligible for. So you answer some questions and it will filter out what you're not going to be eligible for or what's not suited to your business and give you results of what you may in fact be eligible for. So that's my go-to. I'm regularly on that, having a look at what's come out. Most of the time you'll hear in the media what's out, and my immediate action then would be to go on, have a look and read more about the specific opportunity. But certainly using that finder tool as the first go-to. Grant Connect is a great website. This is government grant information, and it's like a system that is basically like a centralized publication, and it's forecast and current Australian grant program and opportunities, but it also states what's been awarded. So I like it because you can go on and have a look at who's been successful and what's been successful in the past, so you can get that insight if you're applying for a particular grant. Self-Start is good. This is really for individuals and supporting individuals through those first stages of starting their own business. And it can help with anything from planning and validating your idea to actually finding more support. That particular site contains a lot of information and links to existing resources. And there's, I think, something like 11 different topic areas there. There's the COVID-19 assistance packages. Again, hopefully we're on the other side of that, but certainly that's the go-to if there is anything that you need by way of COVID assistance. There's EMDG, which I've mentioned to you, so the Export Market Development Grants, that's through Austrade, so certainly go there and have a look. There's research and development tax incentives. Now that basically is there to help companies innovate and grow by offsetting some of the costs of research and development. And it really encourages investment in R&D, essentially is what that's all about. So there is some financial support available there. And landing pads is the last one on that list. Now, landing pads is an interesting one if you are a market-ready Australian business that are looking to, you've either just started up or you're looking to scale up internationally. So that gives you access to some hubs around the world. And there's San Francisco, there's Tel Aviv, Shanghai, Berlin, and Singapore, where you can have an operational base and then just have customized support in that base for overseas expansion in that area. Last I looked, they were accepting future applications for that program because of travel restrictions and that kind of thing, but I'm sure that's open by now. But also keep an eye out for, obviously, networking events. Have a look out, subscribe to as many industry and government newsletters as you can. The ATO brings out a newsletter, business.gov.au bring out a newsletter. Obviously, the small business development corporations and local government organisations will bring out newsletters that will publicise these grant opportunities. So always be scanning the media and looking for opportunities. and reach out, and get onto one of these pages if you do see an opportunity that you think might be suitable to you. It is a process of elimination. One final thing I will say is only ever access government grants through government websites. So beware of any imitations. Official websites will have that .gov.au, like you see on the screen at the moment, and a suffix in most of those URLs. You will never ever pay a fee for applying for a grant or for getting information. So they're always available to apply for free. So if there's anyone that's trying to charge you for that, then you're unfortunately being scammed. So keep that in mind. So that wraps up our session on grants for small businesses. I will stay on now for a couple of minutes for any questions, so feel free to shoot those through. Do keep in mind that as part of this particular Commonwealth Government program, you can get access to personalised business mentorship. Now, that 7-hour package that you see on the screen for $44 is made up of 3 one-on-one sessions with our advisors, or with your choice of advisor, where you can go through anything. It is a digital solutions program, but we can start from the business strategy perspective and then work through into the digital space. So do keep in mind that is a fantastic business advisory service that's available at the moment. And you can certainly reach out for more help on grant applications through that process as well. With that one, there is a bit of eligibility. So you have to have an ABN for us, registered in WA, Queensland or NT. You have to be operating for profit and employ fewer than 20 full-time staff. So follow that link that you see on the screen if you're interested in that. But thanks so much for joining me today. Like I said, I'll stay on now and answer any questions. So feel free to shoot them through. But otherwise, good luck with any grant applications that you decide to go through with.